It is now 2:05 p.m. here in New York City. It sounds like I'm about to read the news. My name is Sean Jacobs, Associate Professor of International Affairs here at the New School. Welcome to this event, a panel discussion on the problem with economics. Before we start, I'd like to read a housekeeping statement. This event is being recorded. I want to remind attendees that microphones are already muted and your videos are off. The recording will be sent to you after the event. If you can please use the Q&A feature throughout the event to send questions to the speakers. These questions will be collected and be addressed to the speakers during the Q&A. The Q&A, which will happen after the speakers have made some remarks and we've had a discussion, will be moderated. So this event is organized by the Graduate Program in International Affairs here at the New School. And for those who want to learn more about the program, we have sent a link to a short video in the chat. The event is part of a three-part lecture series on decolonizing international affairs. The lecture series is presented as part of a spring 2021 course, Theories, Histories, and Practices of Development, Decolonizing International Affairs. I also want to welcome students from that course to the event. Today, we have three panelists. Francisco Pérez is Executive Director of the Center for Popular Economics at the University of Massachusetts-Amherst. Ingrid Harvold Kvangraven is lecturer, or as the equivalent of assistant professor in international development at the University of York's Department of Politics. Ingrid also happened to be a PhD graduate. She has a doctoral degree in economics from the New School for Social Research. And then finally, we have Grieve Chelwa, an economist from Zambia, who happens to be the inaugural postdoctoral fellow at the Institute on Race and Political Economy, also here at the New School. He just joined the New School, actually. Each of these panelists will make remarks for about 7 to 10 minutes. We will then engage with them by asking them questions. By we, I mean myself and Jacqueline Katanekska, who is a PhD student in public and urban policy here at the New School, and is the teaching assistant for that class that I mentioned. So the two of us will ask, I think, at least 2 rounds of questions, and then we'll start asking questions that come from the audience. So the way we're going to do this, Francisco will go first, Francisco Pérez, and he will be followed by Ingrid, and then we'll have Grieve rounding off our speakers. So Francisco, you have the floor.
Yes, welcome everyone. My name is Francisco Pérez. I am a PhD candidate in economics at the University of Massachusetts-Amherst. My thesis is on the CFA franc, which is a currency union of 14 West and Central African countries, mostly former French colonies. And I'm also the director of the Center for Popular Economics. We do workshops and trainings to help regular people understand the economy. We try to help demystify the economy for social and economic justice activists. So if you are interested in learning more, check us out, populareconomics.org. But today I'm here to talk to you about the problem with economics. So there's many problems with economics, but we will start, we only have a few minutes, so I will try to keep it brief. And I want us to focus on the who, the what, and the how when we talk about the issues of economics. So the who is, most academic economists are white and some Asian men based in North American and Western European universities. What economics has become, what economics studies, are typically very kind of small questions using big data from North America and Western Europe. And how at this point is almost exclusively causal inference in quotation marks, using statistical methods, for example, the obsession with randomized controlled trials, which I'm sure both Ingrid and Grieve will mention. So I like visuals, here's a picture. Think of mainstream academic economics today as a white man that skips leg day, right? So if you think of the upper body as econometrics, They are very well developed, very finely muscled. But if you think of the lower body as history, theory, we could also add intersectionality, ecology, and all the rest. As the lower body, you realize that the mainstream economics profession today stands on a very flimsy foundation. I'm going to use several examples from this paper by Johan Fury on African economic history for a few reasons. One, I am currently teaching a class on African economic history, so this is very much at the top of my mind. Two, as you saw in the earlier slide, history is one of the few things, everyone agrees that economists should study more economic history. So I'm also kind of picking on the parts of the profession that do better than others. And then in this case, these are economists who are not only studying history, but they're also studying the economic history of Africa, right? So, if we're gonna find a more well-rounded economics, it would be here. And this is also work that was inspired by some of Grieve's research on the overall publishing of economics papers on Africa. So this look specifically tries to replicate some of Grieve's methods to study African economic history specifically. So what you're seeing here is this is a stacked bar graph. So each of the various shades of gray represent a region that is studied. So these are all the papers published in the top 4 economic history journals. And what you'll notice is all the papers on Africa are actually the darkest shade at the very top of each bar. And as you can tell, it's basically tiny and in some years virtually indistinguishable from zero, although it has gotten better since about 2007 or so. And the citation for the papers here, I'm happy to share these slides after. From the same paper, they also track the number of papers presented at the African Economic History Networks Conference. And what you'll see is the number of papers has grown from less than 10 to over 60. But if you can see, they also list the meeting place for each of these conferences. And you'll notice the first several were at the London School of Economics. Then they had 2 in Geneva, and then they moved to London, and then back to LSE. If you notice, none of these cities are in Africa. These are all, so it's very telling that the African Economic History Network, which again are economists who are trying to do the right thing. They're studying economic history and they're studying Africa. They meet in Europe. And I don't think that the next one is going to be on the continent either. And here's a table that shows you, so all of the papers, they categorize the publishers by where they are based. So not necessarily by nationality. So some of these people could be Africans like Sean who work in New York. So only 13.5% of the papers on Africa were published by authors based on the African continent. And if you believe this chart, Africa-based authors did not contribute to the research literature on any of the other world's major regions. And then finally, I thought this was a really interesting chart. So these are all the top cited authors in the economic history of Africa and where they are based and their names. And what you'll notice is these are almost all exclusively white men, and all but 4 of them are based in the US or Europe. There's one in Turkey, one who is now in the UAE, who's a British scholar who spent the entirety of his career in the UK, and 2 white South African men. So these are, again, the top 25 most cited scholars in African economic history. So just to give you a sense of the scope of the problem. So not to be too arrogant, but some potential solutions with a question mark. So the obvious one is we need more global scholars from the globe. We need more scholars from the global south. And we need to both expand the questions asked in economics and the research, the region studied. So most economists would not disagree with you on this. How do we achieve this? I would say it's pretty obvious that this cannot be done without greater domestic and probably foreign funding of African universities, right? And that is a sort of necessary, although not sufficient condition for improving, increasing the number of scholars from the African continent and the number of studies of Africa. And more importantly, and I'm sure Ingrid will talk to you a lot more about this, it isn't, we must insist on diversity of scholarship and scholars, but it has to be diversity that makes an actual difference, as Angela Davis reminds us. We don't want economists African economists to do the same thing that all other economists are doing now. I don't think that's the point of diversifying economics. So we want diversity that makes a difference. We want economics to look, instead of looking like a white man that skips leg day, we want economics to look like a very well-rounded, well-muscled Black woman. So we must diversify and decolonize, right? It's not enough to simply, again, bring in more kind of African faces. We also need to change what economics is and how it is done. So for me, that means relying on a greater range of methods instead of simply kind of fetishizing econometrics. It's not to say that econometrics is pointless. No one's arguing that. I use econometric methods in my own research, but it cannot be the only tool in your toolbox. One of the problems with economics is, econometrics has become the proverbial hammer, and then every research question becomes a nail. And we must adopt an intersectional and an ecological lens. Economists are not very comfortable talking about gender, about sexuality, about racism, or even about nationality, which is crazy considering that much of what we do, especially in macro, is looking at international comparisons. And the biggest determinant of your income is what country you're born in. And then, of course, we're all facing climate change and global ecological cataclysms. So it's important to also green economics. And to me, the most important thing is to build a social theory from the perspective of the global South, right? And I think this is why Ingrid and I are both attracted to dependency theory, which is, for all of its flaws and supposed failings, it is one of the few examples of a genuine social theory developed by and for the global South. So, we need to diversify and decolonize, right? The problem is economics is done by a very narrow range of people using a very narrow range of methods and exploring a very narrow range of questions. And the goal is to expand the number of people, expand the range of questions, and expand the methods. Thank you for hearing me out, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Francisco. That was really a nice kind of opening to the statements by panelists. So just a reminder to people, if you have questions for the panelists, type it in the Q&A. If it's something like a book that they recommend, they can answer that quickly. But if it's a larger question, we will keep it for when we start asking them questions and have a little discussion with them. So our next speaker is Ingrid.
Thank you so much, Sean, for the invitation. It's great to be back at the New School. And thanks, Francisco, for this really good presentation, which I think in many ways laid a perfect foundation for what I want to say. You kind of show the symptoms of this flawed field dominated by white men based in the global North. So I hope to unpack a bit why the field is like this. So I think there are many problems with economics, of course, but today I want to talk about them from a decolonization perspective. So as with many things, economics has been a latecomer to these debates, and there's very little work on it, even recently. But I'll share some thoughts based on a book that I'm writing with my co-authors, where I see one of them is in the audience as well. So it's with David Cadet, Carolina Alves, and Serbi Kezar. We're writing on decolonizing economics. So I'll first lay the foundations for how to think about decolonizing economics, and then discuss what the implications of this are for the field. And then I'll focus on RCTs, which Francisco already kind of prompted me to do, because I think they're a very clear symptom of colonized economics, basically. So to lay the foundation for how to think about decolonizing economics, we have to start with thinking, with asking, has economics been colonized? And to my mind, there are at least three interrelated ways that we can see economics as colonized. There's many more actually, but since I only have 7 minutes, I'm going to focus on three. So the first one, colonization of economics as the erasure of colonialism. So we can see this in how development of capitalism is depicted in economics, and how colonial legacies are largely removed from economic theorizing more broadly in the mainstream. So in economics, the development of capitalism tends to be depicted as this period of rationality and endogenous technological development. And in this depiction, you see the relationship between capitalism's development on the one hand, and colonialism and the slave trade on the other hand. This relationship is often completely ignored or neglected. So this has led to a Eurocentric view that sees the development of capitalism as something entirely internal to Europe, which is a partial view given the centrality of colonialism during this period. And the field then universalizes this partial view when it expects capitalist economies across the world to function in the same way across social, political, and historical contexts. And the field is, well known to have these universal laws that they think apply everywhere, with some imperfections. And so this completely erases the legacies of colonialism that impact economic relationships today. So that's one aspect. Second is the colonization of economics as the dominance of one Western truth. So especially since the Cold War, the economics field has narrowed a lot to a very monolithic discipline, with neoclassical economics and its varieties have come to dominate. Before that, there was more pluralism. Marxists, post-Keynesians, institutionalists were debating economics, even in top journals. But now it's very monolithic in the mainstream. The New School is an exception here. So presenting mainstream economics as a set of principles based on neoclassical economics amounts to colonization because it denies space for alternative ways of thinking about the world, especially those emerging from former colonies. And it fails to acknowledge that those principles are political and highly contested. Instead, it's presented as, objective principles, truths. And then third, finally, we can think of the colonization of economics as the erasure of power. So with the dominance of neoclassical economics, the field has increasingly become depoliticized and cloaked in this language that suggests that economic theory is neutral, objective, and this language conceals the power imbalances and structural inequalities in knowledge production itself, so within economics. And this erasure has made it difficult to see that the way knowledge is produced in the economics field is itself strongly founded on Enlightenment values like universalism, essentialism, and Western views of modernity. And there's this great book I wanted to recommend by Zen Elvadin and Charishila, Post-Colonialism Meets Economics, which is like one of the few books basically about decolonizing economics in particular, which is very good. So this papers over the fact that knowledge production is ultimately political. You can't have a value neutral or purely empirical way of approaching the world. There's always some lens, some assumption that you make in your analysis. So those are the foundations. So let me move on to the implications, taking RCTs as an example. So these foundations of the discipline have led many economists to believe that they are method-driven and objective, right? I think they really sincerely believe this. And this kind of view of economics led Esther Duflo, who's one of the most famous economists pioneering RCTs today. This view led her to say that, a good economist is like a plumber. So you think about, someone who comes and fixes things, finds solutions, not informed by ideology or theory, just finding whatever, they need to fix your toilet or dishwasher or whatever. So this view of economics as a plumber has supported a massive industry of development economists closely associated with the Poverty Action Lab at MIT, And this approach has strong colonial continuities because it's about fixing people or markets in the global south so that they behave more rationally or operate more efficiently, rather than addressing the systemic problems that produce poverty in the first place. This industry is exclusive of other ways of knowing, including both non-Western and non-mainstream economic approaches. It trains people in the global south to be a part of the knowledge production of the north, rather than considering theories from the south as starting points. So I could go on about how development economics has become increasingly exclusive with the rise of RCTs. And in the book, we're trying to, you make the point that this trend in development economics, it basically means it's returning to its colonial origins. So we can discuss that more in the Q&A if you want. So I want to move on to say that given these foundations and their implications, to decolonize then means to acknowledge that development of capitalism was actually intimately tied to a violent, exploitative, colonial, racist project. This has implications for how we theorize about capitalist dynamics. It means to repoliticize economic theory and give more space for theories emerging from outside of the West. It means to acknowledge that positionality matters. So where you're observing the world from has an impact on how you see it. So it's no accident that dependency theory emerged mostly from the global south when scholars were seeing the very unequal global economy and how it impacted their societies. Similarly, like women are more likely to believe that there's discrimination in the labor market than men are because they see the labor market from a different perspective. It also means to recognize that non-Western theories have a lot to offer to help us better understand the world. And I think both mainstream and heterodox economics can learn from this, because even within heterodox economics, there's still this they still prioritize theories that come from the West. And like dependency theory, for example, that Francisco also mentioned, is often kind of frowned upon and not accepted in the European heterodox communities. And finally, it means to recenter power in our understanding of how economies work, but also of how knowledge production works. So recognizing the role of power in shaping economic outcomes like exploitation, imperialism, structural racism, it's both important to better understand the world, but it also provides a better starting point, of course, for understanding how to change the world. So decolonizing economics is a matter of justice, but it's also a matter of creating a better economics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ingrid. I'm going to give over to Grieve Chelwa.
Professor Sean Jacobs, thank you so much for this invitation. For this very important discussion, and it's also very nice to fellowship with Ingrid and Francisco and everybody else. It's certainly an honor for me. Greetings from Lusaka, Zambia, where it's blistering hot right now, and it's pretty late in the evening. So thank you so much for this opportunity. So I'm going to make some few remarks. I think much of what I'm going to say has already been said by my colleagues. So really the topic here of this discussion is the problem with economics. So the topic really presupposes or presumes that economics has a problem, right? So in trying to talk about this particular topic, I think it is important to distinguish which kind of economics we're talking about here, because there are many kinds and approaches. And some of this really has been articulated by my colleagues who've spoken before me. For example, there are heterodox approaches to the study of economics, and Ingrid certainly has made lots of important contributions there, as well as there are approaches to the study of economics that are popular in particular geographies, or were popular at different points in time in particular geographies. There's been some allusion to dependency theory, for example, and so on and so forth. I mean, for example, if you read for an economics degree at the University of Zambia, the university I attended, or at the University of Ibadan in Nigeria in the 1970s or 80s, you are likely to encounter a different kind of economics. One that did not likely paper over the very real fact that Africa's development, or lack thereof, is inextricably linked to the exploitative power relations between the continent and the industrialized West. This is precisely how students in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s on the African continent in very large measure studied economics. So one can see this in the work of African luminaries like Professor Bade Onimode, who was of the Ibadan school, and others working in that tradition, right? So I would like to argue that the problem really lies with a strand of economics known as neoclassical economics. My colleagues have sort of hinted and talked about neoclassical economics. So the problem really lies with neoclassical economics, sort of an approach to economics that is so dominant that non-specialists and even some specialists think that all economics is essentially in the neoclassical tradition, right? So what is neoclassical economics? To put it simply, neoclassical economics gets its inspiration from sort of broadly from Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, which was published in 1776. And this approach to economics largely emphasizes the primacy of the market in resolving questions about production and distribution, right? And one can see how dominant this particular approach to economics is, right? For example, in the way the so-called Nobel Prize in Economics is awarded, right? Ever since its inception, I think in 1967 or 1968 or thereabouts, many of the recipients of this award have been in the neoclassical tradition. I mean, at some point, there are one or two that might have been considered exceptions, but generally many recipients of this prize have conducted their scholarly work in the neoclassical tradition. And I would argue it's gotten much more so lately. This approach to economics, this neoclassical economics, is also very popular in leading schools in the US and in some parts of Europe. And it's also the dominant framework undergirding much of the World Bank and the IMF's work. As you know, the World Bank and the IMF is particularly influential in influencing policy and policy choices in much of the global South, right? If you read Howard Stein's piece in the recent edition of Economy and Society, the journal Economy and Society, you learn that neoclassical economics has actually taken hold on the African continent, right? So now, whereas before, most of the departments of economics in African universities would teach you different kinds of economics, emphasizing these sort of structural relationships between Africa and the rest of the world. Right now, most departments of economics on the African continent emphasize and teach students neoclassical economics. And this is no accident, but this was really the product of design, because in 1988, and this is contained in Howard Stein's latest piece in Economy and Society, in 1988, the World Bank financed an entity in Kenya called the African Economic Research Consortium. And this particular entity has been quite influential in the awarding of scholarships and the awarding of research grants, but purely to do work in the neoclassical tradition, right? So what I want to argue is that the problem here lies in this particular type of economics. And this type of economics has largely failed in its descriptive and prescriptive endeavors. So the problem is really that what is very dominant in economics is this neoclassical approach. And this approach, I would argue, has failed in its descriptive and prescriptive endeavors, right? I think the purpose of any economics is to describe the economic world, to describe the world around us, and from that to prescribe how the world can be made better. At least that is why I became an economist, right? So I became an economist in Zambia precisely because I wanted to understand why Zambia was poor, largely why the continent that I'm from is lagging behind, and from there to draw out some prescriptions about how the world can be made better. And I'd argue here that neoclassical economics has failed in this endeavor, right? So how has neoclassical economics failed, right? I'll use the case of the economic crisis that afflicted the African continent in the 1980s as a case study. Sort of students of African economic history will know that the African continent suffered a huge economic crisis beginning in the late 70s and taking shape in the 1980s, which saw massive contractions in growth, in incomes, and increases in poverty, especially in the 1990s. The late, great Malawian economist, Andika Mkandawire, is actually called this Africa's Great Depression. In fact, he's argued that the contractions in income and in African economies that happened during this period really rivals and exceeds the contractions in the US economy during the Great Depression of the 1930s. So what was the descriptive failure of neoclassical economics in the African case, right? So neoclassical economics really sees things as either state versus markets, right? And abstracts from geopolitical considerations, unfair relationships between African countries and the rest, geopolitics, economic sabotage, the destructive role of multinational corporations, and then nefarious activities, and so on and so forth. So in neoclassical economics, which was very dominant in the African policy space, really saw the problem as that between states and markets, right? And then obviously from that drew the conclusion that precisely because the state was very big in the 60s and 70s, this is exactly what led to the economic crisis, right? And therefore the prescription was to contract the state, roll back the state, engage in privatization, engage in trade liberalization, and so on and so forth. This wrong prescription led to what Thandika Mkandawire has called the Great Depression, massive declines in income and output, right? And we're still pretty much reeling from the shock of that particular era. If you go to any African country today, incomes are precisely not where they were pre-1980. So we're still really in the throes of this depression, precisely because of this failure to describe the world as it ought to be described. That sort of is very dominant with neoclassical economics, and then drawing out the wrong prescriptions from there. This failure to really do good economics, so this failure to describe and prescribe continues even today, right? So for example, if I ask student of economics to answer this simple question, it was not simply a very difficult question, but to answer the question, what ails Africa, is very, very difficult to come up with a proper story of what really sort of holds back the continent, especially if you're in the neoclassical mode, which is very dominant. One sees this particular evidence in the fact that neoclassical economics fails to understand Africa is contained in Morton Jevons' 2015 book, Africa, Why Economists Get It Wrong. And in there, he really says, if you read the neoclassical economics literature, which is very dominant about the African continent, it's very, very difficult to understand why the continent is struggling with development. So there's a failure to describe, and from there, there's a failure to prescribe what ought to happen. And what you end up with are vague policy prescriptions, for example, like improve institutions, more democracy, teach negotiating skills to girls, which is really sort of this work that's coming out of the RCT mode that Ingrid told us about. You know, if you give deworming tablets to youngsters in Kenya, this will lead to development. If you give out mosquito nets to Zambian households, this will lead to development, these kind of things. So really, there's a failure to prescribe, right? And then you go in this direction of vague policy prescriptions. So I've really argued that the problem with economics is really the problem of neoclassical economics, right? And really that problem can be seen in the failure to describe and the failure to prescribe, with examples drawn from sort of the African economic experience, right? So basically, so what happened here? For example, basically what can be done, right? So what can we do to improve the status quo? And I think my colleagues have really touched on many of these issues. I think it is certainly important to de-emphasize the role of neoclassical economics. We need to go back to that era. Ingrid told us about the era of pluralism and sort of approaches to economics, methodological pluralism, and just different approaches to the studying of the world around us. So we need to de-emphasize the role of neoclassical economics. How does one do that? I think that's sort of a challenge for the students in the audience to help us think about how does one rearrange the power relations that will lead to a dominance of neoclassical economics. We need to diversify and democratize the discipline. For example, if you go back to this era that I spoke about, is the Great Depression in Africa, what one sees there is that many African economists did respond and did write that these particular prescriptions will lead to disaster. But their voices were drowned out, particularly precisely because of the white men and some white women working in the tradition of the neoclassical economics, working at the World Bank, the IMF, and coming out of Ivy League schools in the US. So we really need to diversify and democratize the discipline. I often get folks pushing back saying diversifying in and of itself is not enough. But I think the problem we have on the African continent is that when you speak to African economists, on the ground, they actually know that much of this neoclassical work is nonsense, right? It fails to describe conditions on the ground, but the power relations, the funding arrangements are such that to succeed, you have to do your work in the neoclassical mode. So I think democratizing and diversifying the discipline also requires a rethinking of how funding arrangements are done. We need to perhaps come up with new foundations that are able to fund different kind of approaches to the study of economics. Sean, thanks so much. These are a few things I had to share with colleagues, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A session.
You made me chuckle when you started out. Not that you said Professor Sean or whatever, but more because you quoted Howard Stein. I was like, oh my God, Howard and I used to be colleagues at the University of Michigan, and I used to hang out with him a lot. So I kind of know when he was just like Howard Stein, I was like, oh my God, Howard Stein. In any case, since you brought up Howard Stein, a really nice way, and I think directly Francisco and Ingrid and you sort of alluded to it, it's like this kind of, we need to go back to, well, when you refer to the Ibadan school and so on, we need to go back to like usable past. There's some usable past here. And you mentioned dependency theory. And somebody actually, an anonymous somebody who's attending anonymously said, what is dependency theory? And I was like, there's the ad. So here's an opportunity as a first question, perhaps, since we said we want to decolonize economic theory, we want to, how people talk about economics. Well, here's the opportunity. If you could, what is dependency theory for people who don't know, and how can dependency theory help us now? Since Francisco, you brought it up first, and the others, you can also answer to this question. How can, for example, a method like dependency theory, and I'm talking now just about if I'm thinking in terms of usable past work that people have done already, help us understand economics in this moment.
Yeah, so I'm happy that people are interested in learning more about dependency theory. So really we should call them dependency theories, because there were multiple. So it's a very wide sort of tent that encompassed a lot of thinkers from the global South with sort of different variants from the 1950s sort of through the 1970s. And I would argue that it comes down to two things. One is the belief in an essential qualitative distinction between rich and poor countries, between what are called central or core and peripheral economies. And then secondly, an assertion that something about the global economy either prevents or hinders development of these peripheral countries, right? So if you find someone who believes both of those things, chances are they're a dependency theorist. But again, there was a lot of internal debate. So, it is a very rich tradition that I think is, like you said, Sean, a usable past. And then, some of the other names that Grieve has mentioned, Bendika Kandwere, Ingrid and I work a lot on Samir Amin, right? So there's, a lot there that we're still kind of excavating through, but I think it's up to a new generation of scholars of Africa to build on this and extend these traditions.
But also from Latin America. I mean, that a lot of this kind of I suppose the original work was mostly done in Latin America, right?
Yeah, it was originally associated with the Economic Commission for Latin America, and its first president, Raul Prebisch, an Argentine economist and central banker, who then later went on to found UNCTAD. Sort of was originally associated with Latin America, but quickly took on sort of scholars from Africa, Asia, and the Middle East.
Ingrid and Grieve, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure.
Ingrid, you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, I think Francisco explained it really well, and but it's a very heated debate, like what is dependency theory, and like we've discussed this since we were both PhD students at New School, UMass, and at that time there weren't a lot of people that were interested in dependency theory. It seemed like, at least to me at that time. Now it seems like there is some kind of revival, at least at the margins. But I think what's confusing to a lot of people, and it's basically what Francisco said, that there are so many different theories that explain the polarizing tendencies, basically between the core and the periphery in different ways, using different like Marxist, structuralist, institutionalist perspectives. So there's disagreement, which has led to kind of, I think a lot of people have seen it as a weakness because they think it's confused or not clear about what the reasons are for this polarization. But so I think it's like fruitful to think about it in terms of a research program where you have these fundamental pillars, where what Francisco already said about the polarizing tendencies is key. And I think also the historical aspect, that they look at how colonialism and capitalism developed differently in the center and the periphery, and that this created very different conditions that laid the foundations for Korea to develop differently than Senegal, for example, despite them both having been colonized. And because if you think of it as a research program, it also opens up a lot of interesting research questions. And I saw recently there was a paper that was using dependency theory to actually explain Brazilian business schools. So that kind of brings us back to this kind of, what's the problem with economics? And basically it was like about knowledge production and how there are these dependent relationships also between universities, which also links back to what Howard Steen was saying and what Grieve was talking about. So you can use dependency theory also in this way. And some of the dependency theorists were actually the first to talk about decolonizing social sciences in the 70s. So that's also, quite interesting. And I just wanted to pitch, Francisco didn't mention it, but he has an article in a special issue on Samiramin coming out this week. So keep an eye on the review of African political economy. And they also have a blog where Francisco will also be featured. So this is, and along with lots of other people writing about Samiramin. So this is like an ongoing debate about how to use his ideas to understand the world in different ways.
Grieve?
I think the only thing to add, as I'm not really an expert on dependency theory, but when I did learn it as an undergraduate at the University of Zambia, for me, I think it really fulfilled this sort of descriptive role of what a good discipline should be, right? It described for me precisely why my country was certainly poor, right? That its underdevelopment was really the result of the development of the core, right? So we in the periphery were really being immeasurized at the benefit of the core. So really it fulfilled for me this really powerful sort of role of any good descriptive theory, really describe things for me as they were. If you came and spoke to my grandmother here in Zambia, or my mother, or folks at the marketplace and told them about dependency theory, they'll tell you, duh, it will not be surprising for them because it's accurately descriptive in that sense. But what is really fascinating about this period is just how is it that these different ways of doing economics thrived. I think that's really important for me to sort of figure out how is it that these different ways of economics thrived. Francisco has told us about, Economic Commission of Latin America. The United Nations Economic Commission, UNECA, United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, also did some very interesting work at that time. So what conditions led to this sort of thriving of sort of like these different approaches to doing economics? How is it that the Ford Foundation and these other foundations and many other people were funding these types of economics? I think for me, that's a very interesting question, especially in thinking about how to sort of decolonize, diversify, introduce more methodological approaches into the discipline in this present moment. So that's what I take from this particular era.
Mm-hmm. Jackie, do you want to go ahead with a question?
Sure, thank you. Thanks all of you, Ingrid, Francisco, and Grieve, for joining us today, but especially for your remarks. As just going off of what Grieve was saying, as a Zimbabwean student who comes from one of these periphery countries, I've been really invested in my own work in a decolonial sensibility. And so I appreciate us being able to have this conversation here today. Often, though, calls to decolonize, especially economics, focus on, as you point out in one of your articles, Ingrid, amplifying the voices of non-white or Western scholars, acknowledging and addressing economic power asymmetries, and noting the colonial framework that underpins the field of economics. But I wonder if these measures that are located mainly at an epistemic or scholarly level amount to a true decolonization or the beginnings of a true decolonization of the field, or if it's just another form of reform. And so in thinking through this question, I wonder if you might be able to provide us with an example, and this is me as a policy student asking, of a concrete decolonial economic policy and what that would look like as a means to address what Grieve sort of alluded to with this failure to prescribe.
Is that for anybody?
For anybody, yes, or for all of you.
Well, I think I'll start for once. I think for me, and I think Francisco did allude to this, you know, and it's sort of work that I'm sort of working on and trying to develop fully into, you know, sort of body of work. But a lot of nuggets are hidden in, you know, Africa's sort of immediate post-colonial period, right? I mean, this was a time when incredible achievements were made in the economic sphere, in the social sphere, and so on. So incomes were growing in the first 10 or 15 years following the model independence year of 1960. One sees this incredible growth in incomes, you know, incredible growth in social indicators. I think for many of us, my father, for example, you know, who was born in a village, was able to attend university free of charge, had access to free healthcare, you know, those kinds of things. So a lot of nuggets are hidden in that particular period. So I think a proper sort of attempt to decolonize, right, if it is to mean anything, should revisit that era, because that's an example of decolonized policies, or you know, sort of decolonized policies, which were homegrown. Many of these were homegrown, right? Homegrown, really homegrown. I mean, one of the most interesting things, I'm not a big fan of him, but Hastings Kamuzu Banda, who was the first president of Malawi, I think immediately following independence in 1964, thereabout, sort of they drew up a homegrown plan, and then they invited the so-called leading lights of the time to descend upon Blantyre to discuss Malawi's economic plan, but from the sort of like, from the basis of the Malawian point of view. So the Malawians said, this is our plan. What do you think of it? So I think this sort of, that moment really represents a lot for us to learn. And I think I agree with you. I think I'm also worried about this. I think we see that in this moment of trying to decolonize, right, we're also seeing in many ways a replication of things that have happened before. So I'm also seeing like the voice, for example, you know, the agency and the push for decolonization and the arguments for decolonization and the work to decolonize is moving towards the North a lot. And maybe this is understandable because the North has got access to all sorts of this, but we have to be very careful. I think it's important to also remember that in decolonizing, that process itself should not lead to some idea or some aspect of colonization, right? So I hope I've been very helpful in sort of responding to your question.
Yes, thank you. I think it's important, right, to, as you say, to think about, to move the conversation from a scholarly perspective, right, to an actual praxis. And so the concern, yeah, is how do we develop a decolonial praxis in the field of economics that moves us beyond these scholarly kinds of conversations, which, as you said, are still taking place or are newly taking place in the global North.
Yeah, I think it's an important question. I mean, I think decolonizing economics and decolonizing the global economy are two separate but related projects, which is why we've seen them advance at the same time and retreat at the same time. So, you know, we've referenced this kind of post-colonial, period in the 60s, 70s, until the debt crisis of the 80s, when those two went hand in hand, right? An attempt to build a different kind of economics was intimately tied to an attempt to build a different kind of global economy. And I share your concerns. I worry that that decolonization of economics will remain a kind of niche thing among scholars in the global North. Very ironically, but I do feel like the opposition to those two is instructive, right? It isn't, and I think it's because of the fact that economics is closer to power, right? So someone asked about other social science disciplines, and I think the reason the ideological policing of economics is stronger is because it leads more directly into economic policy, right? So I'm an American, in the United States, there's a Council of Economic Advisors that meets with the president. There's no Council of Sociological Advisors or Anthropological Advisors or historians, right? Not to say that all of those disciplines are completely disconnected from forms of power, but none of them have the kind of privileged position that economics does. So I think it's possible, but it'd be very hard to decolonize economics without decolonizing the economy at the same time.
Ingrid, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, this is such a great question and such an important one. And I think probably like fundamentally, like the material aspect of decolonization is the most important, right? But the universities were always, a fundamental part of the colonial project from the beginning, like to legitimize it and to, legitimize this like civilizing mission, basically, both in the global north and the global south. And you kind of have that same thing again now, right? Where the universities are there kind of legitimizing the unequal global system, but just trying to change the university isn't going to like change the material conditions. So there's so many things that need to be done in order to reverse that, and the universities are just like a minor part of that. But there are some projects that are like ongoing in terms of policies, since you were asking about the policies specifically. I don't know if you were asking about successful policies, because I don't have that many of those, but there's some attempts. And there was this article that was a bit critiqued that came a couple of months ago by Jason Hickel in Al Jazeera that was about like decolonizing the IMF, which is like, there's always this discussion about like, can you really decolonize a fundamentally colonial institution, which is also an issue with the university. But there are some, global South scholars that are putting forth ways to decolonize the IMF. And there are some projects, like, for example, there was a debt audit in Tunisia after the revolution, where they went through the debts and evaluated whether they were legitimate or not, and including IMF loans. And they evaluated that the IMF had given loans that were illegitimate because they had conditions attached to them that led to social unrest. They were like cut in subsidies and stuff like that led to social unrest and ultimately the revolution. So they were asking for reparations, and they were asking for the IMF to, acknowledge their role in creating these conditions across, the global South. And they're like the Bretton Woods project is also working to kind of push the IMF to, do these kinds of audits and pay reparations and acknowledge their role. So there is this like movement, but of course the IMF, and now the IMF is super powerful in the wake of COVID-19 when all developing countries need their loans. So of course, like now is not a good moment really to be able to get those policies through to the IMF. But there are some attempts like that. And I guess also Ecuador did a debt audit as well in 2008, I think it was, and they repudiated some parts of their debt. So there are like things that you can do as a country in the global South. It had some consequences in terms of they lost some investments from the global North, but then they turned towards China and like got investments from China instead. But now they're in a crisis again with COVID, and they have to go to the IMF, and the IMF is forcing them to basically implement structural adjustment again. So yeah, but those are some examples anyway, things you can do.
So we had a lot of questions from the audience, and we kind of put them into a document so we could like organize them. But we sort of reacting to some of the stuff you were answering. But one question, this is also by somebody who didn't give their name, and this was for Grieve and Francisco. They wanted to know, have you personally dealt with scholars who tend to overlook or ignore African economists or scholars like yourself, people of color, African scholars? How did you address it? Like, what did you do? I think this is a good, like, this person is like, put you on the spot. What did you do?
Who's gonna go first?
I mean, I can start. So this is a big, so my response to this is just stubbornness. So I've been told many times that economists do not study places, they don't study actual economies, which I'm sure may be news to some of you. And they definitely do not study Africa, because Africa is 2% or less of the world's GDP. There's not that much data, so kind of why waste your time? So and actually the last time I heard this was at one of the conferences among Black and Latinx economists, right? So another economist of color told me, when I said I studied the CFA Franc, they were like, no, you study international finance. And I said, no, I studied this currency union in Africa. And he was like, why would you? He's like, don't say that to people. You'll never get a job, right? So I just simply ignore that advice, right? And will pay whatever professional price I have to, because I simply think that these people are wrong.
I think for me, I mean, sort of similar experiences to Francisco, but luckily for me, Sean, I've spent a very big chunk of my life on the African continent, sort of, amongst.
So your trouble is only starting.
Well, I mean, I think, and luckily for me, if I do move to New York City, I move to New York City wiser, right? So I'm not going to go and move to New York City naively. But luckily for me, I've been on the African continent where I've been interacting with sort of lots of my people. And we know that much of this work is really nonsense. But I've certainly had instances where, I've been sort of taught things that are sort of either blatantly racist or, racism is implied and those kinds of things. I mean, I remember once I was at a conference where I was making the argument that somebody was presenting some work on Mozambique, famous not for me but famous in the global north, the so-called development economist was making some argument about landmines and how the war in Mozambique explains some stuff. And I asked him whether he had presented this work at Eduardo Mondlane University in Maputo, and he said to me, "Are there economists there?" This is what he. Economists every year, they work in the Ministry of Finance, they work in the central bank, they work in private sectors. Where do you think these people are coming from? And showcases this kind of ignorance. And Francisco is right that for North American economists and sort of Western European economists, Africa may not be marginal, but the few that do work on Africa cause a lot of damage, right? Much of that work sort of like is underpinned by white supremacy and this kind of stuff. And so what my strategy is now is just to avoid. So there are certain crowds that I don't interact with because it's a pure waste of time, right? Because I know the intentions are not good faith intentions, right? I know they're not engaging to learn, but they're engaging to do all sorts of things. So I avoid those crowds, which is real pity. It's a real pity. I choose my crowds very carefully. I choose Sean Jacobs, for example.
Go ahead, Zaki.
Speaking on that, in terms of sort of thinking about the few that cause a lot of damage, both Ingrid and Grieve, Ingrid today in the presentation and Grieve in an article that you shared with us, you both problematize randomized controlled trials as a method for collecting data and creating knowledge. And so what would you offer then as an ethical decolonial methodology for development economics?
So look, I think what I would say is sort of general terms, and thanks Jacqueline for that question. I think just we need to study these countries on their own terms as they are, right? And to go into these countries with a lot of humility, right? To also, realize that there are people in that country who've been worrying about these problems for decades. And, so I can't say, certainly I'm completely bothered, as sort of Ingrid and Francisco alluded to earlier, I'm certainly bothered by randomized controlled trials because I think they are underpinned by lots of very bad sort of assumptions and lots of very bad ideas, right? That people can be studied, you can make certain intrusions into people's lives. I mean, there was that famous study in Western Kenya, which is sort of the epicenter of the RCT epidemic in Africa, with the sort of randomized cash allocations to see if between villages to see if this engenders jealousy. I mean, why would you study this? And why would you do this to people? You'd only do this to people if you think they're not people, right? So almost like, the justification for slavery, for the transatlantic slave trade, you could do it because you thought of Africans as not being people. So I'm completely bothered by RCTs in that sense, quite apart from the methodological issues associated with whether you're learning something from that exercise. I think it's really underpinned by bad senses of kinds of white supremacy. So what's a decolonial way of studying societies? I think it's to first of all have humility and to go into these places with a huge sense of humility. And, you know, in many ways, I know anthropology has got its problems, right? But to sort of do what the anthropologists do, you know, they go to these places and describe those places on their own terms. That's the main essence of sort of a discipline, I think, especially a social science. You know, all these issues, whether economics or social, whether social science is even a good term, but the essence of a discipline is to describe. And then from there, with all sense of humility, try to prescribe, right? So this is what I would say. Now, I don't know what, so you need a combination of tools. Now, some very bad ones, like RCTs, that you shouldn't have in your toolkit, and then some very good ones that you can have in your toolkits. But humility for me is the key.
So go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that was a really, really great answer by Grieve. And I think it's, yeah, humility and taking participants seriously, and you know, experimenting on people is just like, and Nimi Hoffman, who I know Grieve also knows, has done like a really good study on, you know, how kind of dehumanizing RCTs are and how kind of colonial they are. Because if you look at, of course, RCTs are also carried out in the global north, right? But she looks at to what extent participants are asked for informed consent in the global south versus global north. And it's like, to a very little degree in the global south, and in the global north, ethics procedures are much, you know, stricter. So you actually have to ask for informed consent for your participants. But so, you know, that would be like, if you wanted to continue with RCTs, at least, you know, ask for consent among the people that you're experimenting on. But generally, I think it makes much more sense to ask the communities and what they are, you know, what they want, instead of just experimenting on them, and let the research agendas be driven also by the communities that are being studied. Let the agendas be set by those countries or those communities, rather than, you know, the MIT Poverty Lab setting the agenda and then, you know, going into the global south to experiment. Yeah, that was all I wanted to add.
Francisco, do you want to add anything, or because I have a question actually for you, but go ahead.
No, we can. I don't have anything on RCT.
Okay, so there's a question.
Read Ingrid.
Okay, so you agree with them. There's a question here by Niall Gwynn, which I think I'm sort of setting you up. He asked, to diversify who's doing economics, we need to get those from the poorest ends of society interested in economics. So how can we push for them to be engaged? You run a center for popular economics. How can we do this?
So, you know, the work that we do at the Center for Popular Economics is really aimed at this, at trying to reach regular people. And what we find is, you know, one, we rely on popular education, which assumes that people, that everyone's a teacher. And it's actually really easy for economics because we all live the economy. Everyone goes to work, they pay bills, they have rental and mortgage payments. Economics, as it is taught, is a very kind of forbidding field, and people feel very intimidated by it. So part of what we try to do is, because people are interested in economic questions, right? Especially at moments like this right now, there's a lot of debate around all the COVID relief packages in the United States, and people are really, you know, curious to know how all this stuff works. Where's all this money coming from? How much can we afford to do? So, you know, people are anything very interested in macroeconomics, but they feel like they can understand it. So I feel like once we start with people can, you know, once you start from the point that people know the economy because they live it, then it kind of helps them demystify it. So that's where we start with is, you are already an expert. And in many ways, the less formal economics you know, the better, right? Because then we don't have to help you unlearn all of that neoclassical nonsense that we deal with our undergrads.
Go ahead, Jackie. Thank you, Francisco.
Thank you so much, Francisco. That was great. I'm going to draw from some questions that we've been getting from attendees. And there's one question here which I think gets to several different things. It comes from Vanessa Crawford, who's asking, how do we confront both the institutional barriers and the social barriers that prevent underrepresented groups from joining the economics field. And I'd like to put that question together with a question about institutions more broadly. How do we reconcile whether this the problem in these peripheral countries or countries in the global south is a problem of economics or a problem of institutional failures, so corruption, bribery, that kind of thing?
And anybody who either of you want to start with that?
I can go. That's a great question again. Okay, so it's about the economics field, institutional barriers and social norms. And then also the second part was about, is it the internal conditions?
Yeah, internal conditions. And that comes from another student, Dina.
Yeah. Well, so I don't know. I mean, I think the external conditions are ridiculously important and they create these constraints. Of course, there are, each country has like internal dynamics that also play into those constraints. And, the situation is very different across the global south. You have some universities that are actually very strong in non-Eurocentric economic strands in the global south as well, like in Brazil and India and Argentina, Mexico. But they also maybe faced a bit less external kind of conditions. In terms of institutional barriers and social norms, there's so many things that can be done. And I think, starting from how undergraduates, come into economics and how students are treated until how academics, what academics can do. I think there needs to be, we can't just, call for more people of color, more people from the global south, more women, whatever, to bring them into economics without addressing the structural problems that make it very difficult for them to be there in the first place. So citation practices, really important, that Francisco and Grieve kind of touched on, especially Francisco with his, kind of horrifying graphs at the beginning. Citation is political. Make sure you cite, do your homework. There are lots of scholars in the global south doing brilliant work that people in the global north just don't know about. So citation practices is one. Journal editorial boards have so many things that they can do to implement to make sure that they're more inclusive. There's some moves towards doing that, but they're very, very preliminary and weak so far. And economics is among the most hierarchical disciplines in the social sciences. I think in all the sciences, actually, even compared to natural sciences. It's ties to the editor, super important. And even in heterodox journals as well. So, it's not just a problem of the mainstream. So that's something that needs to be dealt with. The whole ranking system, that benefits neoclassical economists and economists based in the global north as well. And then, of course, the social barriers as well. That there's a lot more. There was an article that came out, I think it was today or yesterday, about teaching evaluations and how scholars from minority backgrounds or marginalized identities were, just get really bad evaluations, even if they teach, the material really well. So all these biases that affect promotion and all of these things, funding and whatever. So those need to be, addressed across the board. I don't know exactly what exact policies, there needs to be a political will there within the institutions, within the funding bodies, within the journals and within the universities. And that goes beyond what's kind of currently on the table in terms of a lot of the universities are launching decolonizing projects now, but they tend to be about diversifying rather than decolonizing. It tends to be a label more than actually reversing the colonial legacies of the university. So I think there needs to be basically the will needs to be there before we can get any of those things addressed. Yeah, I'll stop there. I've talked too long already. So.
Francisco?
Yeah, there's several things. The first is to change the way undergraduate education works. Right now, economics education at the undergraduate level either ignores your concerns or is actively hostile to them if you're a woman or a person of color from the global South. I remember sitting in an economics 101 class and being told that minimum wages led to unemployment, that rent control led to less housing, that paying for health insurance was bad for young people. And I was coming from a place where, I was happy my dad had a union job. I was happy I was not kicked out of my gentrified neighborhood. And I was sad to not have healthcare, right? And I immediately walked out of that class and was like, I want nothing more to do with these people, right? So the first thing is changing that perception so that you actually, because most of our undergrads are men overwhelmingly, and then most of those are white, right? So, and they're usually people who are pursuing careers in business. At the graduate level, you have to change who they think the ideal candidate is. Right now, if you want to be an economist, you basically have to be a math major. It actually does not help to be an economics major, and God forbid you study history or something like that, right? So if you aren't, first of all, if you don't know that, and two, if that isn't appealing to you, then that already is excluding a ton of people. And then once you are a PhD and an academic professor, as Ingrid said, the biggest issue is I think the discipline is incredibly elitist. We cannot overstate the impact of the incestuous group of 4 or 5 universities and 4 or 5 journals that dominate everything, right? So I don't know how you change that other than, just stop citing those journals and stop caring about those professors. But, I think we need to look at it at all 3 levels. And that's going to require organization, right? It's only going to happen if the previous sort of partial reckoning in economics in the late 60s, which saw the creation of the Union of Radical Political Economics, it saw the rise of the National Economic Association, which is a group of Black economists, only happened because the students pushed for it, right? This was the late 60s, the worldwide revolution. Campuses were filled with student protests throughout the world. And that's the only reason we even have a usable past to look forward to is because of those movements and those students.
Grieve, do you want to add anything?
I'll just speak very quickly to say, I think we need to, in many ways, dispel this myth that all economics and all economic thinking happens in the North and Western Europe. There are over 50 African countries. Each one of them has at least 1 university. Most of those have economics departments with economics professors who know a damn lot about their local realities. I mean, if you came to Zambia, for example, went to the University of Zambia, you spoke to my professors who taught me, I mean, you would just learn a lot from them. So I would put in a plug for African universities, come study here, just come and study here, spend some time here, to use again in your classical prediction, maybe this one is right. If you come study here, maybe that will force them to change, right? Force competition or discipline them into changing their very bad ways. I mean, my heart goes out to minority students in the global North. I mean, I did a postdoc at Harvard and I taught a seminar on economic development. And the stories I heard from the African students who were studying at Harvard, and just basically the blatant racism in these kinds of classes, exactly what has been sort of shared by my colleagues, that, the original sin of economics was to justify colonialism, to justify, imperial exploitation and those kinds of things. So when sort of an African student goes to Harvard or goes to wherever and asks, I want to know why Africa is poor, just imagine the kind of racist responses that this professor is likely to spill. So just come study here, come study in Africa, and that's one way you could do it.
So this is a question by Piki Kayombo, and it was for Grieve. They comment by saying, firstly, very interesting remarks, but they would like to find out what economic part would be the right prescription for the global South. I know, Grieve, you often call it the global majority, especially that your discussions, you saying that neoclassical economics is the problem. So what would be the prescription? I think this person's kind of pushing you a little bit to wanting to know, do you have a prescription then for the global South? I know we're talking a lot about Africa, but we're also thinking here about Asia, Latin America. So yeah, if you want to respond to that.
Thanks for that question, Piki. I think Francisco made the argument much earlier about the importance of history and economic history. I think there are lots of very important lessons in history, right? Again, the African history immediately following independence is also very instructive in terms of, how you can meaningfully develop. Also the experience of East Asia, the experience of some countries in Latin America that have taken off is also very instructive. And I think a proper economic policy requires some aspects of understanding policy. So we need to politicize economic policy making, a sort of point that Ingrid made earlier. The problems of development are not simply economic technocratic problems. I mean, like they sort of interspace issues of politics, economics, and so on and so forth. So I think the challenge to students of economics today who want to meaningfully make an impact, who want to make a meaningful impact, is to really try to study those, how is it that even within Africa, you've got sort of different development trajectories. What happened there, right? Why is Botswana a success story, right? Let's go to South Korea, right? What were the conditions for South Korea to take off? What were the conditions for Malaysia to take off? What are the conditions for, countries in South America that have taken off? And how much can we learn from that for our own sort of unique set of circumstances? So this is what I would say is the way to do it. Yeah.
You're on mute, Sean.
Sorry, Francisco, do you want to just respond also to, I think Antonio Posada in the chat is sort of asking the same kind of question, but they sort of asking in reference to Latin America and saying that in some countries, for example, even like, for example, in Colombia, they don't think that what we are describing here is even a problem. So I don't know if you want to say something about that, given you're based in this part of the world. Yeah.
I mean, we could spend hours talking about this, but I would say Latin America has been more thoroughly colonized. You're talking about centuries of colonialism compared to Africa and Asia, and it has settler colonialism, as South Africans know, is a very different beast, and it creates a constituency for further colonization. Right? These are folks who benefit from colonization and it's ongoing as an ongoing process. So I think that, what I would want to do, what I always joke with my Dominican family is, they're obsessed with Spain. I'm like, go to Spain. First of all, they won't know the Dominican Republic is. And if they do, they only know it as a tourist destination, and they will certainly not think of you as white, Catholic, or Hispanic, right? So part of my, I wish I could just put them all in a boat and say, go to Europe, and they will tell you how thoroughly colonized you are, is my short answer.
Okay, I was speechless after that, Jackie.
Thanks for that. So I have a question here from one of our attendees, Nedson Goma, who wants to push you all a little bit and says that heterodox economic strands in themselves are not immune to colonial assumptions. Moving forward, if we do move towards these schools of thought, how do we ensure that we are adopting a body of work that represents the reality of the global majority? And that's for any and all of you.
Yeah.
Maybe
Okay, no, go ahead.
Because I know Ingrid is sort of a resident expert on heterodox economics, so I'm sure she'll have much better things to say than I can say. I think the argument that I'm making is not for a particular type of economics, right? I'm making an argument for an approach to studying societies that sort of where one proceeds from the basis of humility, right? And one, tries to describe those societies as humanely as one can do that, right? And sort of noticing that the objective here is to make people's lives better, right? So I think when one proceeds from that point of view, then it's not entirely clear that this is how you should do it. You should use heterodox economics, neoclassical economics, or you should use dependency theory or different types of approaches to economics. I think for me, the governing principle is sort of proceed from the basis of humility, right? And also proceed from the basis of recognizing your own positionality, allowing others to thrive, allowing others to be part of the process and that kind of stuff. So this is what I would say, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I just wanted to add specifically on the heterodox part, and thank you for the question, by the way. It's a really, really great question. And as I see, you're right in the in the chat you've clearly read the book, and there is a lot of critique of heterodox economics, for also being like a lot of it is centered on these views of modernity and also universal laws. Like you have post-Keynesian textbooks where they say they have principles of how the economy works as well. So there's this like universalizing narrative in some parts of heterodox economics as well. So that needs to be addressed. And I think this debate about decolonizing economics is, I mean, it's very nascent in economics generally, but it has more potential within heterodox economics, because in a way, like decolonizing neoclassical economics is like almost a contradiction in terms, because the whole point is that they see their approach as neutral and objective, and people are rational, and power is removed from the analysis. So how can you decolonize something where power isn't recognized? Whereas in heterodox economics, at least power is central, and like structural aspects like structural discrimination, history is really important in most heterodox strands, maybe not all. So therefore, like I think decolonizing economics has a lot more potential for progress. And what was it that you said? To ensure that we adopt a body of work that represents the reality of the global majority. Yeah. So I think there's a lot more potential for achieving that through a decolonized heterodox economics. But that doesn't mean that heterodox economics is enough to decolonize. We need to really bring these discussions into heterodox spheres, and that's kind of starting to happen, and I have some hope that that it'll get somewhere. But I mean, there's a lot of resistance there as well, and I mean, heterodox economics in the global north is still dominated by white men, mostly European and American. So there's a lot of the same challenges, but at least sort of the intellectual apparatus is more open to the kinds of ideas of decolonizing economics.
Yeah, so Ingrid's comments reminded me, one of our friends, Serbi Keshar, tweeted out yesterday a paper that looks at, that does a similar work to what I presented today on who are the most cited authors in heterodox economics. And once again, surprise, surprise, white men in Western Europe and North America, right? So, and Ingrid and I have faced pushback from peers in the heterodox field for pushing forth decolonizing the field and for talking about dependency theory. And then, how do we know we're speaking to the concerns of the global majority? I wanted to highlight something that Grieve said, because I've also, I refer to it as the grandma test, which is does this make, is what I'm saying common sense to our grandmothers, right? And much of what dependency theory has long been common sense to people in the global south, especially workers and peasants. And it's only in certain more rarefied spaces that such things become sort of either impolite to say or simply believed to be false, right? So there's obviously it's not a foolproof method to simply say these are the common sense of a group of people, but I do feel like it points us in the right direction, that it kind of passes the smell test, right? People are like, this feels right? Like it feels like no matter what, we've had different kinds of government, different kinds of policies, and yet we end up, with the same result, right, or similar result. And I think that's one of the big lessons of the crisis in the 80s in sub-Saharan Africa was all, you had a really wide range of governments trying to do different things, and most of it ended up in tears, right? So I feel like it points you in that direction. And again, I feel like most people in the global south agree with the general principles of dependency theory, even if of course there's lots of nuance and debate.
So unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time together. I wanted to close with two sort of thoughts before I thank everyone. The first is that we're joined here today by one of my former professors and former colleagues, Barry Herman, who has a wealth and breadth of knowledge in economics and in development policy particularly. And he said, kind of the bad news about all of this is that these conversations have been being had for almost the last 50 years, as I'm sure we all now know, but that the good news might be that there is space now for these critiques to be heard anew, and that perhaps there is space to be successful, as so much of the kinds of policies and economics that resulted from those earlier conversations being ignored have now been discredited. So, you know, this kind of emphasis on rational financial markets, on small states being sufficient, on questions of distribution. So I think we can leave feeling optimistic that there are theoretical as well as sort of concrete headways being made. And I think in terms of what we can be thinking of doing as students or scholars or practitioners is to go back to this point raised a few times this afternoon by Grieve about humility and acknowledging our positionality, doing the research from the places of the research as opposed to doing research about these places. And so I just wanted to close then by thanking our panelists for such a generative conversation, both intellectually and practically. Ingrid, Francisco, and Grieve, it's been such a pleasure to have you here today. Thank you also to the International Affairs staff here at the New School. This event wouldn't have been possible without your coordination, and so we deeply appreciate you. And as always, thanks, Sean, for coordinating this panel. And with that, I'll let us all go. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us. Thank you for the invitation and for being here today.
Thanks for coming, guys. I really appreciate it. You are the next generation.